I didn't know my salary had been cut until I opened my banking app on a Wednesday morning and saw a number that didn't make sense. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Banks mess up. Apps lag. Numbers refresh. I closed it, reopened it, checked again. Same amount. Short by almost 30%. I sat there longer than I should have, staring at it, trying to rationalize how a paycheck I'd received every 2 weeks for nearly 4 years could suddenly shrink without a single email, meeting, or warning. No HR notice. No revised contract. No performance review. Nothing. That was the morning my life at the company quietly cracked open, and it all traced back to one sentence that would later make perfect sense. The CEO cut my salary to hire his cousin. At the time, though I didn't know that yet, I worked at a mid-sized logistics and software firm based in the US, the kind of company that liked to call itself family-owned, even though it had hundreds of employees and private equity money floating somewhere in the background. The CEO, Daniel Mercer, loved that phrase. He used it in town halls, onboarding sessions, investor emails. We're a family here. We take care of our own. I believed it for a while. That was my mistake. I wasn't fresh out of college when I joined. I had experience. I'd been hired to stabilize operations after a rough expansion year. My role sat in an awkward but powerful place between finance, payroll oversight, and internal reporting. I didn't approve payments, but I prepared them. I didn't sign checks, but I knew exactly where every dollar was supposed to go. Daniel liked to call me reliable. He said it in meetings, sometimes jokingly, sometimes like a compliment. If it touches payroll or compliance, it goes through her, he'd say. She doesn't miss details. That reliability became an expectation, then a dependency, then something they assumed they owned. The first few years were intense, but straightforward. Long hours, tight deadlines, executive pressure. But my pay was solid, my role respected, and my job felt secure. I wasn't chasing promotions. I just wanted stability, predictable income, clear boundaries. That illusion lasted until Daniel's cousin showed up. Her name was Lila. She arrived one Monday morning without an announcement. No internal memo. No LinkedIn post. No please welcome email. She just walked in behind Daniel, smiling like she already belonged there because she did. Daniel introduced her in the open office area like this. Everyone, this is my cousin Lila. She'll be helping us streamline operations. That was it. No title. No reporting line. No explanation of what operations she was streamlining or why we suddenly needed help doing it. I remember noticing 2 things immediately. First, Lila had no badge. Second, she walked straight into an empty office that had been locked for months and sat down like it had always been hers. By the end of the day, she had an email address, access to shared drives, and calendar invites to meetings she hadn't been introduced in. She asked questions that made it obvious she didn't understand how the company actually worked. She also spoke with a confidence that made people hesitate to challenge her. Family confidence. Untouchable confidence. At first, I didn't care. People come and go. Consultants show up, pretend to help, then disappear. As long as it didn't affect my work, I stayed focused. It affected my work within a week. Lila started requesting reports directly from me instead of through her supposed manager. She asked for payroll summaries, department cost breakdowns, contractor payments. Things that were sensitive. Things we normally didn't hand over casually. When I pushed back and said I needed approval, she smiled and said, "Oh, Daniel said you'd help." Daniel always said that. So I helped carefully. Limited access. Redacted files. Nothing out of policy. That's when Daniel called me into his office for the first time about budget adjustments. He didn't say salary. He said budget. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, calm voice. "We're tightening a few things this quarter. Temporary adjustments. Nothing permanent." I asked what that meant for my department. He smiled. "You're flexible. You'll be fine." That was the whole conversation. 2 weeks later, my paycheck dropped. No email. No meeting. Just less money. I went straight to HR. They looked confused. Pulled up my file. Scrolled. Paused. "That's strange," the HR rep said. "Your salary change was approved." "Approved by who?" I asked. She hesitated. "By the executive office." I asked when I was notified. She didn't answer that. She just said, "It looks like it was processed correctly." That's when I realized something important. Paperwork can be correct even when everything else is wrong. I didn't scream. I didn't threaten. I didn't accuse anyone of anything. I asked for documentation, a revised offer letter, a memo, anything. HR said they'd circle back. They never did. That afternoon, Daniel emailed the entire company announcing Lila's official role. She was now Director of Operational Efficiency. That title hadn't existed before. The timing wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. By the end of that week, I did the math. My salary reduction almost exactly covered her compensation. He hadn't cut costs. He had shifted them from me to his cousin. That alone was insulting. But what made it dangerous was how he did it. Because I was still the one preparing payroll. And now I was preparing payroll that reflected my own cut. Every 2 weeks, I saw it in black and white. My name, my hours, the reduced amount, approved, logged, processed. Daniel never mentioned it again. Lila, on the other hand, acted like she'd earned every cent. She started giving instructions that contradicted existing processes. She asked vendors to bypass normal invoicing. She requested temporary reimbursements that didn't go through accounting first. She wanted exceptions, and Daniel backed her every time. When I raised concerns, Daniel called me overly cautious. When I flagged inconsistencies, he said, "We're moving fast. Don't slow things down." When I asked how her role interfaced with compliance requirements, he said, "She's family. I trust her." That sentence would matter later. 3 weeks after my salary was cut, payroll froze Daniel's account. Not the company's account. His personal executive draw account. That doesn't happen casually. I didn't know it had happened right away. I found out the way I found out most things at that company, by accident while cleaning up someone else's mess. It started with a vendor email marked urgent. They said a payment had bounced. An executive reimbursement tied to Daniel's account. They wanted to know if it was an error or a stop. I checked the system. The transaction status wasn't failed. It was held. Held means flagged. Flagged means compliance review. Compliance review means something much bigger than a bounce check. I escalated it quietly like I always did. No drama. No gossip. Just process. That's when I noticed a pattern. Lila's reimbursements had been pushed through under executive exception codes. No documentation attached. No receipts uploaded. Just approvals from Daniel's login. Some of those approvals occurred at times Daniel wasn't even in the office. Some were late at night. Some overlapped with meetings where Daniel was physically present elsewhere. That's when I stopped assuming incompetence and started suspecting something else. I didn't confront anyone. I documented. That was my instinct. Always had been. I pulled logs, access times, approval trails, IP addresses. I noticed something small, but critical. Lila had Daniel's credentials. Not official delegation. Not proxy access. His actual login. That violated internal policy. It violated external compliance standards. It violated common sense. And it explained everything. The rushed hiring. The salary cut. The sudden need to move fast. The exceptions. The silence. Daniel wasn't just favoring family. He was letting her operate as him, which meant every questionable transaction tied back to his authority, which meant if something went wrong, it wouldn't be Lila on the line. It would be Daniel, or anyone whose name appeared in payroll records connected to those approvals, including mine. That's when the fear set in. Not emotional panic, practical fear, because I knew how this ended when companies started moving money carelessly. I'd seen it before. Audits, freezes, investigations, and I knew something else too. Once payroll freezes an executive account, it's not random. It's protective. They freeze first. They ask questions later. I went home that night and opened my laptop. I reviewed everything again. Slowly. Carefully. I didn't sleep much. The next morning, Daniel called an emergency meeting. He didn't mention payroll. He talked about loyalty, about trust, about how outside pressure was forcing difficult decisions. He looked at me more than once while he said it. After the meeting, Lila cornered me near the elevators. She smiled, the same smile she'd had on her first day. "You don't need to worry so much," she said. "Daniel takes care of his people." I looked at her and realized something chilling. She genuinely believed that. She believed family meant protection. She didn't understand that systems don't care who you're related to. Payroll systems, especially. And neither did I. Because by then, it was already too late to pretend nothing was wrong. The freeze wasn't an error. It was a warning. And the next move wouldn't be quiet. By the time Daniel realized his executive draw account was frozen, half the building already knew something was wrong. Not because payroll announced it. Payroll never announces anything like that. But executives behave differently when money stops moving the way they expect it to. Emails get shorter. Meetings get canceled. Phones stop leaving their hands. Daniel walked into the office late that morning. Not rushed. Not frantic. Just stiff. He went straight into his office and closed the door, something he almost never did. Within minutes, Lila was at my desk. She didn't smile this time. "Daniel said there's an issue with payroll," she said, lowering her voice. "He needs you to fix it." I didn't look up right away. I finished typing the line I was working on, saved the file, then turned to her. "What issue?" She hesitated. "His account. There's some kind of hold." I told her the truth, but only the part that couldn't be argued. "There's a compliance flag," I said. "When that happens, payroll can't override it." She frowned. "But you run payroll." "I prepare it," I corrected. "I don't clear flags." She stared at me like that distinction was ridiculous. "Well then, who does?" I told her. Internal audit. Legal. Sometimes external review, if it escalates. Her face changed at the word audit. She walked back to Daniel's office without saying anything else. 10 minutes later, Daniel emailed me. Subject line, urgent. He asked me to come see him immediately. I brought my laptop, not because I planned to show him anything, but because I didn't go into closed-door meetings without documentation anymore. Daniel didn't ask me to sit. He stood behind his desk, arms crossed. "What's going on with payroll?" he asked. I kept my tone neutral. "There's a compliance hold on your executive draw account." "Why?" he asked. "Because transactions were approved under your credentials that don't match policy," I said. He narrowed his eyes. "Approved by me." "Approved using your login," I said. "Those aren't always the same thing." That landed harder than I expected. His jaw tightened. "I need that cleared," he said. "That's not something I can do," I said. "Once it's flagged, it's out of payroll's hands." He leaned forward. "You work here because I trust you." I didn't respond to that. Trust wasn't a tool. It wasn't a permission slip. "I need to know exactly what you sent to audit," he said. "I didn't send anything," I said. "The system flagged it automatically." He didn't like that answer. "You've been overstepping lately," he said. "Questioning decisions that aren't yours to question." I let that sit. Then he said it. The thing he probably assumed would scare me into compliance. "Your position here isn't untouchable." I looked at him calmly. "Neither is yours." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was dangerous. I left his office without another word. That afternoon, internal audit contacted me directly. They asked for documentation, logs, access records, payroll change authorizations. I gave them everything, including the timestamp showing my salary reduction approval, including the executive exception codes tied to Lila's reimbursements, including the IP data showing approvals coming from devices not registered to Daniel. I didn't editorialize. I didn't accuse. I didn't speculate. I just gave them facts. By the next day, the freeze expanded. Company credit cards linked to Daniel's authority were restricted. Certain vendor payments were paused, pending review. Lila's reimbursements stopped entirely. That's when panic started to leak into the office. Lila stopped making eye contact with people. She stayed in Daniel's office more. Voices got louder behind closed doors. At one point, I heard Daniel say, "You told me this wouldn't be an issue." She responded, "You said it was fine." Neither of them noticed me walking past. HR called me in again. This time their tone was different. They asked about my salary change. Specifically, why there was no signed acknowledgement for me on file. I told them there wasn't one. They asked who initiated the change. I told them to check the approval log. They did. The look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. Because the approval wasn't clean. It had been rushed, backdated, pushed through under executive authority without proper notice, which meant the company had violated its own employment policy, which meant my pay cut wasn't just unethical. It was illegal. HR didn't say that out loud, but they didn't need to. They asked if I had been pressured to accept it. I said I hadn't been given a choice. They asked if I had documentation of my original agreement. I said I did. They asked if I was willing to cooperate with an internal review. I said yes. By the end of the week, legal counsel was involved. Daniel stopped coming to meetings. Lila stopped pretending to be in charge. And the company realized something it should have realized earlier. When you mess with payroll, you don't just upset employees. You trigger systems designed to protect the company from itself. On Friday afternoon, I received a message from Payroll Systems. Account freeze extended pending investigation. It applied to Daniel and anyone whose credentials had been misused, including Lila. She came to my desk one last time that day. Her voice was sharp now, defensive. "You could have handled this internally," she said. "You didn't have to let it get this far." I looked at her. I didn't let anything happen. The system did. She scoffed. "You think they care about you?" I thought about my paycheck, my contract, the logs, the rules. "I think they care about liability," I said, "and that's not on my side or yours." She stared at me for a long moment, then walked away. That night I got an email from legal. They wanted a formal statement. I knew what that meant. The review was no longer internal. It was about to get external. And once that happens, no one controls the timeline anymore. By the time legal asked for a formal statement, I understood that whatever protection Daniel thought family loyalty gave him had already expired. Legal doesn't ask for statements when they expect to quietly clean something up. They ask when they're preparing for exposure. I wrote my statement the same way I handled everything else at that company. Chronological, factual, no emotions, no conclusions, just what happened when it happened and who authorized what. I included dates, times, system screenshots, approval trails. I didn't include opinions about Lila or Daniel's character. I didn't need to. The record spoke loudly enough on its own. 2 days later, I was pulled into another meeting. This one included HR, legal, and someone from internal audit I hadn't met before. He introduced himself as if we were equals. Calm voice, neutral posture, someone trained to listen without reacting. They asked me to walk them through my role, then my salary change, then the cousin hire, then the payroll flags, then the access logs. Every time I finished answering, there was a pause while someone typed. No one interrupted me. No one challenged me. That told me more than questions ever could. When they asked if I had shared any of this outside the company, I said no. When they asked if anyone had pressured me to modify records, I said no. When they asked if anyone had asked me to override the freeze, I hesitated, then answered carefully. I was asked to fix it, I said. I said I couldn't. They wrote that down too. That meeting ended with a sentence I will never forget. This matter is now outside executive discretion. Daniel didn't have power anymore. Not over this. Not over them. The next shift in the office happened quietly. Daniel stopped emailing the company entirely. Messages that normally came from him now came from executive office. Meetings he used to lead were suddenly postponed until further notice. Lila stopped coming in at all. Her office stayed dark, her computer untouched, but her impact was everywhere. Vendor accounts were being reviewed. Old reimbursements were pulled. Some payments were clawed back. The finance team worked overtime reconciling transactions that should never have been approved in the first place. And every time they traced a questionable approval, it led back to Daniel's credentials, or what appeared to be his credentials. One afternoon, internal audit asked me something that made my stomach sink. Do you believe Mr. Mercer knowingly shared his login information? I answered honestly. I believe someone else had access, I said. Whether he allowed it or not, I don't know. That answer mattered, because intent changes everything. If he knowingly shared access, it was a violation of executive policy and internal controls. If he didn't, then his account had been compromised under his authority. Either way, responsibility stayed with him. That's how these systems work. Meanwhile, HR circled back on my salary. They admitted the reduction had not followed procedure. They admitted I had not been properly notified. They admitted there was no signed consent. They told me they were reviewing corrective options. I asked a simple question. Will my pay be restored retroactively? They said they needed legal approval, which meant yes, but only after they confirmed how bad things were going to get. Daniel finally reached out to me directly late one night. Not through company email, through my personal phone. I didn't know how he got the number. His message was short. We need to talk. Off the record. There's no such thing as off the record when lawyers are involved. I didn't reply. The next morning, he sent another message. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. That one made me laugh. Not because it was funny, but because it was desperate. He still thought this was about control. It wasn't. It was about consequences. That same day, I was informed that external auditors had been engaged. That changed everything. External auditors don't care about office politics or family relationships. They don't care about who founded the company or who's related to whom. They care about numbers, controls, and whether regulatory lines were crossed. They requested full payroll records for the last 18 months. That included executive compensation. That included my pay. That included Lila's. That included reimbursements tied to personal expenses disguised as business costs. Daniel tried to intervene. He called a company-wide meeting. He stood in front of everyone and talked about growing pains and misunderstandings and temporary disruptions. He said audits were normal. He said everything was under control. He said nothing about his cousin. He said nothing about my salary. But people weren't listening the way they used to. People had seen executives lose access to company cards. They had seen vendors complain about unpaid invoices. They had seen legal and audit walking the halls. They had seen Lila disappear. The myth of control was gone. That afternoon, I was asked to sit with the external audit team. They asked detailed questions, not about personalities, about processes, who approves payroll changes, how executive exceptions are documented, whether login credentials are shared, what safeguards exist, and whether those safeguards had been bypassed. I answered everything truthfully. When they asked if I believed the salary reduction was connected to the hiring of Lila, I paused. I can't speak to intent, I said, but the timing and amounts align. They nodded. That was enough. By the end of the week, Daniel was placed on administrative leave. The announcement was brief. No explanation. No farewell. Just a statement that leadership would be handled by the board pending investigation. The phrase pending investigation is corporate language for we are not protecting him anymore. The day Daniel was escorted out, he didn't look at anyone. Not me. Not the team. Not even his office. He walked out like someone who knew arguing wouldn't help. Lila never returned, but her name kept coming up, in expense reports, in approval logs, in emails she'd sent using Daniel's account, emails instructing vendors to route payments in unusual ways, emails requesting expedited reimbursements, emails that now looked like evidence. 3 days later, Payroll processed a correction. My salary was restored, retroactively, with a note labeled compliance adjustment. No apology, no explanation, just money. That was when it fully hit me. This wasn't just a story about favoritism or betrayal. It was about how easily power convinces people they're untouchable, and how quickly systems remind them they're not. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong, because when the board starts asking questions, they don't stop at the obvious answers. And the board was just getting started. Once the board took over, the tone of everything shifted. No more soft language. No more temporary disruptions. No more pretending this was just a misunderstanding that could be smoothed over with the right talking points. The board doesn't manage feelings. They manage exposure. They issued a company-wide notice that all financial decisions made in the past 2 years were subject to review. That included compensation, reimbursements, vendor contracts, and executive privileges. People started whispering, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let fear settle into the building, because everyone knew what that meant. If you benefited from shortcuts, you were about to be asked why. If you signed off on something you didn't fully understand, you were about to explain it. And if your name appeared on approvals that didn't match policy, the board wasn't interested in excuses. They were interested in liability. I was called in again. This time, it wasn't legal or HR. It was 2 board members and outside counsel. No small talk. They asked me to confirm my role one more time. Then they asked something that caught me off guard. Were you aware of any family members of Mr. Mercer receiving compensation outside of formal hiring procedures? I answered carefully. I was aware of one family member hired into a formal role, I said. I wasn't aware of any others. They exchanged a look. Then one of them asked, "Were you aware of payments to entities linked to Mr. Mercer's relatives?" I paused. I hadn't been. Not until that moment. I said so. They nodded again. Wrote it down. That's when I realized something bigger was happening. This wasn't just about Lila. Lila was the visible problem, the obvious one, the person people noticed. But the board was digging for patterns. They wanted to know whether Daniel had a habit of blurring lines between personal and corporate money. They wanted to know how far back it went. They wanted to know who helped him, knowingly or not. Over the next week, departments were interviewed one by one. Finance, operations, procurement, IT, anyone who touched approvals or access controls. I was asked to walk audit through payroll systems in real time. They watched how approvals were generated. They asked who had override privileges. They asked how login credentials were managed. That's when IT dropped something explosive. Daniel had requested a reduction in security restrictions months earlier. Specifically, he asked for multi-factor authentication to be disabled on his account due to travel inconvenience. It had been approved. That meant anyone with his password could log in without additional verification. That meant Lila didn't need special access. She just needed his trust, or his carelessness. The board was furious. That single change explained how approvals happened outside normal hours, from unknown devices, without alerts. It also explained why the system didn't flag access violations sooner. Daniel hadn't just shared power. He'd weakened the controls designed to keep him honest. Meanwhile, the financial picture kept getting uglier. External auditors found reimbursements categorized as business travel that didn't match any corporate trip. They found consulting fees paid to shell entities that traced back to personal accounts. They found vendor contracts awarded without competitive bids, approved solely under executive authority. None of it had gone through me directly, but my department's records had been used to legitimize it. That was the part that made me angry. Not emotional anger, professional anger. My work had been used as a shield. That's when I was asked something that changed my position in the investigation. "Were you ever instructed to adjust records retroactively?" outside counsel asked. I said no. Then they asked, "Were you ever discouraged from asking questions?" I thought about the meetings, the comments, the warnings about overstepping. "Yes," I said. "I was told I was being overly cautious." That mattered too, because discouraging oversight is itself a violation. By the end of the second week, the board suspended several executives who had signed off on exceptions without documentation. None of them were family. They were loyal. They had trusted Daniel. That loyalty cost them. HR sent another message. They wanted to discuss restitution. Not just my salary. Potential penalties. Potential damages. They asked if I intended to pursue any external claims. I told them I was cooperating fully and would wait until the investigation concluded. That was the truth. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth to be documented clearly enough that no one could rewrite it later. Daniel finally broke his silence publicly. He issued a statement through his attorney. He claimed he had been unaware of irregularities. He blamed a rogue employee. He didn't name Lila, but everyone knew who he meant. That statement didn't land the way he thought it would, because by then the evidence trail was too clean, too detailed, too technical. You can deny intent, but you can't deny logs. You can deny knowledge, but you can't deny approvals. And you definitely can't deny that you cut someone's salary without consent to fund a role that shouldn't have existed. The board placed Daniel's compensation under escrow. That meant he couldn't access any deferred pay, bonuses, or equity distributions. That's when I heard the phrase that made this feel real. Personal accounts may be subject to recovery. Payroll didn't just freeze his account. They were preparing to claw money back. And clawbacks aren't polite. They're aggressive. They assume wrongdoing and ask you to prove otherwise. Lila's name appeared again in the audit findings. Payments made on her behalf for housing, travel, and consulting expenses. All approved under Daniel's login. All charged to corporate accounts. All now flagged. She hadn't just been hired. She'd been subsidized. And Daniel had covered it by taking from someone he assumed wouldn't fight back. Me. By the time the third week ended, the board announced they were cooperating with regulators. That meant the story was no longer contained. That meant timelines were no longer internal. That meant consequences were coming from outside. I went home that night knowing one thing for sure. This was no longer about my salary. It was about how far someone will go when they believe rules are optional, and how many people get hurt before systems finally push back. The next phase wouldn't be quiet. It would be public. The moment regulators entered the picture, the company stopped pretending this was an internal misunderstanding. Regulators don't care about reputations. They care about statutes, reporting requirements, and whether laws were broken in ways that trigger penalties. The board sent out another notice. This one was longer, more formal, carefully worded by lawyers. It confirmed that certain financial practices were under external review. It instructed employees not to delete emails, messages, or files. It warned against discussing the investigation outside approved channels. That's when fear really settled in, because people knew what that meant. Someone was going to be blamed, and not everyone involved was a villain. Some people had just followed instructions. Some had trusted leadership. Some had assumed if something came from the CEO, it had to be allowed. That assumption doesn't protect you when regulators ask questions. I was contacted directly by a federal compliance investigator 2 days later. They didn't introduce themselves dramatically. They didn't threaten. They just asked if I was willing to speak voluntarily. I said yes. The interview lasted hours. They asked about my role again, then about Daniel, then about Lila. They asked how salaries were approved, how exceptions worked, how payroll flags were handled. They asked if I had ever been told to conceal information. I said no. They asked if I had ever been retaliated against. I paused. Define retaliated, I said. They did. I told them about my salary cut. That got their attention. I explained the timing, the lack of notice, the absence of consent. I showed them documentation. They asked who benefited from the change. I told them. They asked if I believed the cut was linked to the cousin's hiring. I said what I had said before. The alignment was exact. They wrote everything down. They didn't promise anything. They didn't react. But when they left, I knew something had shifted. Because salary manipulation tied to nepotism isn't just unethical. In certain contexts, it's illegal, especially when it's used to mask misallocation of funds. Daniel's attorney tried to frame the narrative quickly. They leaked statements to industry blogs suggesting Daniel was a victim of internal sabotage, that an employee had gone rogue, that procedures had been misunderstood. That narrative didn't survive long, because regulators don't rely on gossip. They rely on records, and the records were ugly. They showed a pattern of behavior, not a single mistake. They showed repeated bypassing of controls. They showed personal benefit. They showed coercion masked as leadership. Meanwhile, Lila resurfaced. Not at the office. Online. She posted vague messages about betrayal, about loyalty, about being targeted unfairly. She never mentioned the company, never mentioned Daniel, but everyone knew. What she didn't know was that her online activity was being monitored too. Public statements matter during investigations, especially when they contradict documented evidence. The board issued another update. Daniel's administrative leave was now permanent pending outcome. His authority was fully revoked. Security access terminated. Benefits suspended. The phrase for cause started appearing in documents. That phrase changes everything. For cause means the company doesn't owe you grace. It doesn't owe you severance. It doesn't owe you silence. It means they believe you violated trust in a way that justifies punishment. I was asked if I would testify if required. I said yes. That wasn't bravery. It was inevitability. Once you become part of the record, there's no stepping out quietly. The investigation expanded. They started looking at prior years, at other family members, at related entities, at patterns of hiring and compensation. And suddenly, Daniel's image as a clean, charismatic founder unraveled. People remembered things they had ignored before. The cousin who briefly consulted years ago. The travel expenses that never quite made sense. The sudden role creations. The exceptions that were always approved. It wasn't new behavior. It was just the first time someone documented it properly. My role at the company became strange. I was still working, still processing payroll, still doing my job. But now people looked at me differently. Some with respect, some with fear, some with resentment. I heard whispers that I had taken down the CEO, that I had gone nuclear, that I had destroyed the company. None of that was true. The company destroyed itself by letting one person operate without oversight. All I did was refuse to lie. One afternoon, HR asked me how I was holding up. I told them I was fine. That was mostly true. I wasn't enjoying this, but I wasn't panicking either, because the chaos wasn't coming from me. It was coming from years of unchecked behavior finally colliding with reality. The regulators issued formal notices of potential violations. That meant fines were likely, penalties possible, restitution probable. Daniel's personal finances were now fully under review. Not just his company income, his private accounts. That's when I heard the line that made me pause. They're freezing assets. Not hypothetically, not as a warning. They were actually doing it. Because when money moves improperly, regulators stop it from moving at all. Payroll had frozen his account first. Now everything else followed. 3 weeks. That's how long it took from the day my salary was cut to the day Daniel lost access to his money entirely. 3 weeks to go from CEO to liability. Lila deleted her social media. Her lawyer issued a statement denying wrongdoing. Daniel's lawyer stopped issuing statements altogether. Silence took over. The kind of silence that means negotiations are happening behind closed doors. And negotiations only happen when there's something to lose. The company survived. Barely. Emergency board meetings. Cost controls. Damage control. Clients asked questions. Investors got nervous. But the business kept moving. Because it had to. Systems don't stop just because leadership fails. As for me, I kept working. I showed up. I documented. I answered questions. I did exactly what I had always done. The difference now was that the truth had momentum. And once it starts moving, you can't slow it down. By the time settlements started being discussed, the story inside the company had completely changed. No one talked about loyalty anymore. No one used the word family in meetings. That language had been quietly retired, like an outdated policy no one wanted to reference. Now the focus was survival. The board hired an interim CEO, someone with no history, no relationships, no emotional investment. His first message to the company was blunt. He acknowledged failures. He acknowledged risk. He acknowledged that trust had been broken at the highest level. He didn't defend Daniel. That was deliberate. When leadership distances itself, that clearly it's not temporary. It's strategic. The regulators moved fast after that. Faster than anyone expected. Because once patterns are established, the rest is math. Daniel's accounts weren't just frozen. They were analyzed line by line. Every transfer, every reimbursement, every overlap between personal and corporate funds. They found enough to justify formal charges. Not dramatic arrests or courtroom scenes. White-collar cases don't look like that at first. They look like filings, subpoenas, negotiations, pressure. Daniel's legal team pushed for a settlement. The board pushed back because settling too early can look like admission. And admission opens doors no company wants opened. Meanwhile, Lila became a liability Daniel couldn't protect. She was no longer employed, no longer shielded by executive authority, no longer invisible. Regulators interviewed her separately. Her statements conflicted with Daniel's. That mattered, because when stories don't align, someone's lying. And lying during an investigation is worse than the original violation. The company was instructed to calculate damages. That included improper reimbursements, unauthorized compensation, and wage violations. My salary cut was officially categorized as a violation, not a misunderstanding, not a budget adjustment, a violation. That meant penalties. It also meant I wasn't the only one affected. Audit found 2 other employees whose pay had been temporarily adjusted during Daniel's tenure without proper consent. Smaller amounts, less visible, but still illegal. The pattern was clear. Daniel didn't just take from me. I was just the one position to notice. The board authorized restitution, not quietly, formally, with documentation, with interest, with legal acknowledgement. That matters, because once something is acknowledged legally, it can't be undone by narrative. I received a letter outlining compensation owed to me, not just back pay, additional damages, legal costs. The letter didn't include an apology. It didn't need to. The numbers spoke clearly enough. I signed the acknowledgement and returned it. The same day, the company announced a full restructuring of executive oversight. New controls, new approvals, mandatory access audits, mandatory multi-factor authentication, mandatory documentation. Everything Daniel had bypassed was now locked down tightly. That's always how it goes. Controls only matter after someone abuses them. Daniel's settlement talks dragged on. He resisted. He argued intent. He argued ignorance. He argued trust. None of that worked. Because intent doesn't erase outcome. Ignorance doesn't excuse negligence. Trust doesn't override compliance. Eventually, his legal team changed strategy. They stopped denying. They started negotiating damage control. That's when I was informed that I might be called to testify if talks failed. I prepared, not emotionally, logistically. I reviewed records again. I reviewed timelines. I made sure my documentation matched the official findings. I didn't embellish. I didn't soften. I didn't dramatize. I stuck to facts. That's how you survive these things. Lila disappeared from public view entirely. Her name still appeared in documents, but she stopped posting, stopped responding, stopped trying to control the narrative. Her silence suggested something else. She had been advised to stop talking, because talking would only hurt her. The company released its final internal report. It concluded that Daniel had violated fiduciary duty. That phrase is serious. It means he failed to act in the best interest of the company. It means personal benefit influenced decisions. It means consequences are justified. The board voted unanimously to terminate him for cause. They stripped him of titles. They revoked unvested equity. They authorized pursuit of clawbacks. That meant Daniel didn't just lose his job. He lost future earnings tied to the company he built. That's rare and devastating. The regulators accepted a partial settlement, fines, monitoring requirements, mandatory reporting. The company paid a price, but it survived. Daniel did not come out unscathed. His reputation was damaged permanently. In industries like this, reputation is currency. Once it's gone, it doesn't regenerate. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He cut my salary quietly, assuming no one would notice. 3 weeks later, Payroll froze his account. Months later, everything else followed. I wasn't celebrated. I wasn't rewarded with promotions or speeches. I wasn't asked to mentor anyone. I wasn't put on a pedestal. I was just allowed to keep doing my job. That was enough. Because the outcome wasn't about me winning. It was about the truth being recorded accurately enough that no one could erase it. And in the end, that's what systems are for. Not justice. Not revenge. Accountability. The story wasn't over yet. Because once something like this becomes public, it doesn't stay contained inside one company. And the final consequences were still unfolding. When the case became public, it didn't explode the way people imagine scandals do. There were no headlines, screaming names in bold letters. No dramatic footage. No viral outrage cycle. It unfolded quietly, through filings, through industry reports, through regulatory summaries that most people never read. But the people who mattered read them. Investors, boards, compliance officers, executives at other companies who recognized the patterns because they'd seen them before or were quietly doing similar things themselves. Daniel's name started appearing in places he couldn't control. Not interviews, not announcements, footnotes, case summaries, compliance bulletins. That's worse, because you can't spin footnotes. You can't argue with them. They just sit there, permanent, unemotional, factual. The company issued a public statement acknowledging regulatory findings and confirming leadership changes. Daniel was not named directly, but the description was precise enough that anyone paying attention understood exactly who it referred to. He didn't respond publicly. He couldn't. Anything he said could be used against him. The board moved forward. They closed the chapter as efficiently as possible. Internally, things stabilized. Slowly, departments adjusted. Controls tightened. People adapted to a version of the company that no longer revolved around one personality. Work continued, but the damage lingered. Clients asked questions during renewals. Partners hesitated before signing. Reputation doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes, piece by piece. I was asked one last time to provide testimony, not in court, in deposition. It lasted most of a day. I answered the same questions I'd answered before. Who approved what? When? How? Why the salary cut mattered. Why the login access mattered. Why payroll flags aren't optional. The opposing counsel tried to frame me as disgruntled, as someone seeking revenge, as someone who overreacted. That didn't work, because my documentation didn't change, because my actions were consistent, because my story never shifted. You can discredit emotions. You can't discredit logs. After that, my involvement ended. Officially, no more interviews, no more statements, no more requests. I returned fully to my role, not unchanged, but clearer. I understood now how fragile systems are when people stop respecting them. I also understood how dangerous silence can be. Daniel eventually reached out again, not directly, through a mutual contact. The message was vague. He wanted to clear the air. I declined. There was nothing left to clear. The air had been documented, archived, and finalized. Lila was charged separately, not as severely, but enough to end whatever professional credibility she thought she had. Nepotism doesn't protect you when money is involved. It only delays consequences. The company completed its regulatory monitoring period. They passed. Barely. But they passed. New leadership settled in. The phrase family-owned was quietly removed from marketing materials. No one missed it. I stayed, not because of loyalty, not because of forgiveness, because the work mattered and the environment had changed enough that it no longer felt compromised. Sometimes staying isn't weakness. Sometimes it's practicality. Daniel faded from the industry. No new roles. No consulting gigs. No advisory positions. His name became something people avoided saying out loud. That's how these things end most of the time. Not with punishment you can watch, but with exclusion you can't fight. Months later, I found an old email. The one where Daniel had first called me reliable. I reread it, not with anger, with clarity. Reliability had never been the problem. Assumption was. He assumed I wouldn't notice. He assumed I wouldn't document. He assumed I wouldn't speak. He assumed wrong. The salary cut wasn't the beginning. It was the trigger. And once triggered, systems did what they were designed to do. The last board update came and went. The case closed. The company moved on. And so did I. Not dramatically. Not triumphantly. Just steadily. Which, in the end, was the most honest outcome. When everything was officially over, there was no announcement to market. No email saying the case was closed. No meeting to explain what had happened in plain language. Things just stopped happening. No more legal requests. No more audit follow-ups. No more carefully worded memos. That silence was the real ending. Work settled into something almost normal again. New routines replaced old ones. New leadership habits formed. People stopped checking their inboxes with a knot in their stomach. Daniel's name faded out of conversations completely. Not because it was forbidden, but because there was no reason to mention it anymore. That's how accountability usually looks from the inside. Quiet, administrative, final. Every now and then, someone new would join the company and ask why certain controls existed, why approvals took longer than expected, why payroll processes were so strict. No one told them the full story. They didn't need to. Those controls were the story. I never became a symbol. No one held me up as an example. No one asked me to speak about ethics or courage or integrity. I was fine with that. Because the moment something becomes inspirational, people start treating it like an exception instead of a rule. And this wasn't an exception. This was what happens when someone believes power makes them immune. I sometimes think about the exact moment Daniel decided to cut my salary. Not how it felt. Not the shock. The decision itself. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was practical in a twisted way. He needed money. He had access to authority. He assumed silence. He didn't expect systems to notice. He didn't expect me to document. He didn't expect consequences to move faster than loyalty. 3 weeks. That's all it took from the first reduced paycheck to payroll freezing his account. People like to believe these things take years. They don't. They only take years when no one is watching. The company never apologized directly, but my records were corrected, my compensation restored, the violation acknowledged. That mattered more than words. Because words can be denied. Records can't. Sometimes people ask me why I didn't just quit when my salary was cut. Why I didn't walk away and find somewhere else. The answer is simple. If I had left, the story would have ended quietly. And quiet endings protect the wrong people. Staying didn't make me brave. It made the truth unavoidable. I don't feel satisfaction about what happened to Daniel or Lila. I feel clarity. They weren't punished because of me. They were exposed because of their own decisions. I was just positioned where those decisions became visible. And visibility changes everything. So here's what stays with me. Not the drama. Not the fallout. Not the numbers. The realization that most abuse of power doesn't look dramatic in real time. It looks like a budget adjustment, a temporary cut, a favor for family, a quiet exception, until it isn't quiet anymore, until payroll freezes an account, until regulators step in, until documentation tells a story no one can rewrite. That's the part people don't talk about. Systems aren't emotional. They don't care who you are. They don't get tired. They just wait, and when someone pushes too far, they respond. Not loudly, not immediately, but decisively. That's where this story ends. And now I want to know what you think. Do you believe people like Daniel know they're crossing lines, or do they convince themselves rules don't apply to them anymore? If you were in my position, would you have stayed and documented everything, or would you have walked away and let it collapse on its own? And how often do you think this kind of thing happens quietly in places we never hear about? Let me know your thoughts down below, and also like, share, and subscribe.